Welcome to The Favorites, the podcast presented by Bet365. We are part of the Action Network. I am Chad Millman, Chief Content Officer of the Action Network. Today is opening day for Major League Baseball, but in the past week, the hottest topic in baseball has not been who will win the World Series, or is Juan Soto the difference for the Yankees, or is Shohei Ohtani worth $700 million. It is about Ohtani. It is about the gambling scandal that has surrounded him and his now former interpreter. In the category of holy crap, does our next guest have amazing timing? Keith O'Brien, an award-winning capital J journalist and New York Times best-selling author, has a new book out this week. The man at the center of baseball's biggest betting scandal of all time, Pete Rose. The new book is titled Charlie Hustle: The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose and the Last Glory Days of Baseball. Available now wherever fine books are sold. This week, we ran an excerpt of the book on actionnetwork.com in which Keith revealed MLB had been investigating Pete Rose's betting habits for more than a decade before it was revealed he had been betting on baseball and ultimately banned from the sport. We will get into what the past has taught us about handling betting, handling today's betting scandals, like the one with Ohtani and his interpreter, plus new revelations in the book, which, by the way, the Wall Street Journal calls compulsively readable and wholly terrific. As always, I am joined by my co-host, my companion, my compadre, my BFF, professional bettor, Simon Hunter. Hello, Simon.
Yeah, what a day for Chad. Chad somehow knew months ago, his spidey senses, the intuition, to line up this interview this week with everything that's happened. So yeah, hat tip to Chad. You can't teach it, people. You're either born with it or you're not. And my guy Chad is born with it.
Listen, I can claim no credit. All credit to Keith. He and I first chatted in January about having him come on the show the week the book came out, which is this week. I've read the book, and we are going to ask a lot of questions about gambling. I do want to be clear. This book is much, much bigger than Pete Rose and his gambling scandals. It is brilliant. It is thorough. It's an examination of the often scandalous life of the best hitter and probably the most intriguing personality in baseball history, who even into his 80s now still captures people's imagination. We're going to get to Keith in 1 second. As a reminder, the Favorites podcast is presented by North Carolina's newest sportsbook, Bet365. Bet365 doesn't do ordinary. That's why you get more boosts with them than with anyone else. Every day they power up the odds on hundreds of bets to give you a chance to win more. Bet365 boosts specific markets, your winnings, and even parlays, and they don't stop there. Keep an eye out for their biggest and best odds with the incredible Super Boost. Check out the boost and see why it's never ordinary at Bet365. Must be 21 or older and present in Arizona, Colorado, Indiana, Iowa, Louisiana, North Carolina, New Jersey, Ohio, Virginia, or 18 and older in Kentucky. Gambling problem, call 1-800-GAMBLER or 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. Terms, conditions, restrictions apply. If you're in North Carolina, take advantage of the best sign-up offers at Bet365 and across every sportsbook. A link to all those offers can be found in this episode description. If you're in North Carolina, check out the link in the episode description. As a reminder, catch every episode of The Favorites live on YouTube. For those enjoying on YouTube, don't forget to give us a like and subscribe to the Action Network YouTube page. Finally, Cincinnati's finest, New York Times bestselling author of Charlie Hustle, Keith O'Brien. Dude, tell us how crazy it has been to have this book come out this week. Give us some of the stories.
Well, it's been bananas. Chad, thanks for having me. Simon, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. When we talked a couple months ago, we talked about this book and the research and the writing of it. And when you live in Pete Rose's universe, as I now do just by accident, it's a weird place, and it's a place where chain reactions happen, and one person calls another, who calls another, who calls another, and I'm now in that place. And the Shohei Ohtani stuff has set off its own chain reaction in Pete Rose's world. Last week when the news broke, I was shocked, just like you guys and everybody else, because it was surrounding Shohei Ohtani, the golden god of baseball. But I wasn't honestly that surprised that it was happening in general. In my book, some of the men who chased Pete Rose in the 1980s, the investigators, predict that it's only a matter of time before another player gets himself in trouble again. And immediately, the chain reaction happened. And most people now, your listeners and viewers have seen Pete Rose's viral video, where he jokingly said, I wish I had had an interpreter in the 1970s and 80s. I was walking uptown to my very first book event on Tuesday night this week. I'm on the Upper West Side. I'm in a panicked rush to get there, feeling all the pressure of releasing the book, et cetera, et cetera. And I get a text, and the text is from Tommy Giosa. And Tommy Giosa was one of the guys in Pete's inner circle in the 1970s and 80s. I interviewed him for about 14 hours. And Tommy placed Pete's bets on sports with bookies. He paid his debts. He walked around town with a satchel full of cash. And ultimately, Tommy Giosa is placing Pete's bets on baseball. So Tommy texts me and he says, have you seen the video? And I said, of course. Yeah, I saw the video. And Tommy wrote, LOL, I guess he forgot that I was his interpreter in the 1970s and 80s. And it's true, right? I mean, Pete didn't have an interpreter, obviously, but he very rarely placed his own bets. He had guys doing it. And I'm not here to suggest, that this is what's happened in the Dodger locker room. But it's just something that happened in Pete's world, and who knows what has happened here.
Simon, what is your take on that as a guy who is intimately familiar with operationally how these things work, on what he's saying about the opportunities?
I was say I have about 10 interpreters working for me as well. So I totally get where they're coming from, both guys. It's just not pro athletes that have interpreters working for them running bets either. So yeah, I love that little parallel right there.
So Keith, this has been a crazy week because of the Ohtani stuff. What are some of the parallels you are seeing between the Ohtani story and the Pete Rose story?
Well, obviously, the one difference, just to get it away off the top, is at the moment, there are no allegations that Ohtani bet on baseball or that his interpreter bet on baseball. It's a big difference for all the reasons everybody knows.
Yeah.
That said, I mean, there are some stunning parallels. It was, Pete Rose's inner circle who was placing bets. It wasn't very often Pete. On only a handful of occasions did he ever personally interact with a bookie. It was Tommy Giosa placing the bet. It was Paul Jansen placing the bet. Mike Bertolini placing the bet. All three of those men I spoke to. So that's one. Two, just as it's happening in LA right now, it was a federal investigation by federal investigators, specifically in Pete Rose's case, the FBI in Cincinnati, who began investigating shady activities in the underworld. And it was originally the Tommy Giosas, the men in Pete's inner circle who pop up onto the radar of federal investigators. It's not Pete Rose. It's only months in that they realize, interesting, these men are connected to Pete Rose. And then I guess the third thing is, just as happened last week, it's the press who, holds baseball's feet to the fire. In 1989, it was Sports Illustrated who begins to dig into a tip about Pete Rose's gambling on baseball. And that tip, which floats across town to the offices of Major League Baseball on Park Avenue, makes them realize they can't sit around. They got to take action. They got to call Pete Rose. They got to have a meeting. Initially, that's a secret meeting. In this case, it's the LA Times, it's ESPN digging into a story that explodes onto the sports landscape. And just like with this one right now, the Pete Rose scandal, blew up just, right before opening day. And that scandal in 1989, for those who didn't live through it, or for those who have forgotten, I mean, it swallowed the season. It consumed it. And I don't know what's going to happen next. I think anyone who says they know what's going to happen next with the Shohei Ohtani story is just wildly speculating. But if they're going to do a serious investigation at Major League Baseball, it's going to have to take weeks. It might take months. And they might not even be on their own timeline, because, again, there's a federal probe happening in Southern California. So who knows when this ends?
Yeah, and just to piggyback and close the loop on it, I do appreciate ESPN's reporting on it. I thought they'd be too close to it, and the fact that they put out there, I think just on Tuesday, right, Chad, that Ohtani's representation has not said they've pressed any type of charges yet. Again, someone that apparently stole $4.5 million. Interesting, nonetheless.
Yeah,
so,
it is. I know, Simon, I know you want to jump in with a question, but let me just close the loop on this.
Yeah.
It will be very interesting, Keith, and I'd love your opinion on this. I do wonder, Ohtani came out, had his press conference the other day, said he was shocked, said he didn't bet on baseball, said he didn't make any bets at all. I do wonder, and I hope, are people still digging around? Or will, the media landscape has changed quite a bit. I think there was what SI did, how dogged they were. That was a different time. And will people just sort of accept Ohtani's word for it? Will they continue to dig around? None of us have that answer, but Keith, I am curious to sort of get your take on, do you see such a massive difference in how investigations and how leagues are covered from then to now that you think the rest of this will be uncovered by the feds and Major League Baseball, or will media continue to play a role?
I wrote a story for The Atlantic about a month ago, right when those sweeping layoffs took place at what is left of Sports Illustrated, the shell of Sports Illustrated. And, the whole premise of the article was that, we're losing sports journalism, real on-the-ground sports journalism. And just from an objective standpoint, there are just fewer and fewer reporters on the beat. There are fewer and fewer reporters in the locker room. And, as all of us know, it's harder and harder to get access to these guys, in the way that reporters once had, let's say back in 1989. So I do think it will be a challenge. That said, I would be incredibly disappointed as a journalist if the Los Angeles Times, at a minimum, hasn't peeled off 4 or 6 reporters and put them strictly on the Shohei Ohtani story. Because you get this, Chad. I mean, this is for some reporter, whether they're at ESPN or some other outlets or the Los Angeles Times, this is potentially that story of a lifetime. And, I know there's been a gutting of the media workforce, but there are still reporters out there who want that story. And I got to believe right now that there are teams of reporters chasing down the story of what really happened. And at a minimum, I would expect within days some big blowout article about the alleged illegal bookmaker himself.
Shout out, by the way, to the dogged Matt Rybaltowski of Sports Handle and Action, who broke a story last week that the feds had been investigating the guys connected to the bookmakers, connected to Ohtani's interpreter for 5 years. Like, these guys have known about him for a long time. So, I know at least one guy who's on the case. Simon, you wanted to dig in a little bit more.
Yeah, just to throw it back to the Pete Rose story, there's so much that goes on in my life where I think of the people that are in my life, and, everyone's got to sign non-disclosures nowadays. It's just part of the business I'm in. Everyone I work with, this was not the way it was in the 70s, 80s when Pete Rose was running around. So I would love to know why his guys, his dogs, his friends, people he took really good care of, are now happily to speak to you for 14 hours and spill the beans on this guy's life? Did he burn that many bridges? And just what's the whole thing behind that? Why all of his runners have now kind of turned on him all these years later?
There's two answers to that. The first is, I did get access to Pete Rose for the book. I was able to do 27 hours of recorded interviews with Pete, which is meaningful for all the reasons everybody knows, but also meaningful because, Pete had never before spoken to an author writing a book unless he had some sort of editorial control of the book, which he did not have here. And that might be why Pete Rose has stopped calling me back many months ago. But in the time that I was, with Pete Rose and had access to him, he did help open doors for me. I mean, it was Pete who introduced me to Tommy Giosa. And Tommy and Pete are still close today. But Tommy is his own man. He's in his 60s now. This is a scandal that in many ways defined and destroyed Tommy's life, even though he has completely rebuilt it. And so, as much as this is my book, Charlie Hustle, is the story about Pete Rose, it's also about the characters who were in his orbit. And one thing that I found time and again is that if you happen to pass through Pete Rose's universe in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, you often got sucked in by his gravitational pull. And it happened to guys like Tommy Giosa, young admirers who just wanted to hang out with Pete Rose. And then once they were in his inner circle, could not believe that they were hanging out with Pete Rose and then would happily do anything. But it also happened to, important men in their own right, like, say, Bart Giamatti, the former commissioner of baseball. Bart Giamatti is an incredible man, but you could write an entire book about Bart Giamatti. And yet Bart Giamatti's life and career is forever entangled with Pete Rose's life. So, Tommy spoke to me initially because Pete gave him my number. But he kept talking to me even after Pete stopped. And others in his inner circle, have had a long beef with Pete Rose. Because when things fall apart in 1989, it is for the classic gambling reason, Simon, and I know you'll appreciate this. It falls apart over money. Again, not only were there no non-disclosures that were being signed back then, there was some pretty disorganized bookmaking and tabulating that was happening. And ultimately, there is a disagreement over a sum of $44,000. One of the men in Pete's inner circle says he's paid off a bookie to the tune of $44,000. And Pete either disagrees with that sum or disagrees with the fact that he paid it at all. One thing that Pete Rose did a lot of was just let his debts ride. And because he was Pete Rose, bookies let it happen in a way that they wouldn't say for you or me or, some other guy in Cincinnati. They let it ride for Pete. And but when Paul Jansen, another man in his inner circle, pays off that debt, Paul wants his money back, and Pete won't pay him, and they never agree on that sum, and it implodes from there.
Can you frame how big of a deal Pete Rose was in the 70s and 80s? Because, before we come on the show, Simon is talking about Pete Rose as a Philly. Simon's a baby. Like, he didn't see Pete Rose play for the Phillies. Everybody knows the legend of Pete Rose, hit king, banned from baseball. But can you put in context what a big deal he was?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is he's bigger than Shohei Ohtani right now. And that's a crazy thing to say because Shohei Ohtani is the most recognizable, most famous baseball player in the world. But because the media landscape was more centralized in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, we all saw the same world through the same prism. And so when you were famous in the 70s or 80s, your fame was just automatically larger. And so Pete Rose was one of the most iconic Americans in the 1970s and 80s, and he was beloved not because of his Rookie of the Year award or his multiple batting titles or his multiple World Series titles, his MVP, or even his all-time hit record. All of those things were great, of course, and amplified his fame again and again and again. But even if he had only some of that, he would have still been beloved because people loved him for how he played. He, as the title of the book suggests, he hustled, and that hustle was real. He knew from a young age on the west side of Cincinnati where he was raised, that he had to work hard to make it, because Pete Rose was never the best player on his childhood baseball teams. He was never the best player on his high school baseball team. He probably never should have gotten a shot at the minor leagues. Today, he wouldn't get a shot at the minor leagues because the minor leagues are smaller. He played initially in the minor leagues in a rung that doesn't even exist anymore. So, he gets this shot because he's working hard, he's hustling, he makes that clear on the field. This was a man who sprinted to first on walks, who would get into fights at second base, breaking up double plays, and who once, as many of us will remember, broke a man's shoulder slamming into the catcher at home plate in a midseason meaningless exhibition all-star game. And so we love him, America does, because he hustles and because he reminds us of that great American story, right? The one that we all still even believe today, that if you work hard, if you try hard, if you dedicate yourself, if you hustle, you can make it. And so we love that story. There is a real element to it, but then the press, amplifies this story and really gilds the mythology of Pete Rose, making him like a god in America by the late 1970s.
Also, baseball was bigger. They were winning a lot of World Series. That team was legendary as a dynasty, the Big Red Machine, the Reds in the 70s. And the ability to see this team was so scarce. If you were a fan of baseball, but you lived in Texas, maybe you're getting them once a week on television, right? And so, athletes today, imminently more knowable, a lot less accessible. And Pete Rose was the opposite of that, because there was an ability for the media to get to him and project what he was and create, like you said, a mythology. But that also meant he was getting away with a lot of shit. And so you wrote this week on actionnetwork.com that people were aware of and looking into his betting habits as far back as the mid-70s. Explain what your book uncovered.
Yeah, so one thing I really wanted to do was go back and remind readers who Pete Rose was. So we're going to talk about the glory. We're going to talk about the Big Red Machine years. We're going to repaint the story of the 1975 World Series, in graphic detail, because all of that is important, because we don't care about Pete Rose's fall if we don't remember why we cared about him in the first place. And the other thing I was doing, especially in my interviews with Pete, we would talk about the 1975 World Series or, the 1970 All-Star game when he slammed into Ray Fosse, the catcher at home plate. But we also need to talk about the gambling. And one thing I wanted to do was figure out when it started and how it unraveled, because it clearly does. And so, my reporting shows, and not just based on interviews with Pete, but then interviews with many other people and also court documents, that Pete Rose's gambling with bookies begins at least by the early 1970s. This is before he's ever won a MVP or a World Series. And he's betting with a bookie on the west side of Cincinnati, almost like a pal, right? And, if you were alive in the 70s and 80s, people had those kind of bookies, the neighborhood guy. And that was who Pete was betting with for a while. But by the mid-1970s, there are concerns. Again, based on my reporting, in 1975, during that epic World Series between the Red Sox and the Reds, Johnny Bench, future Hall of Famer, Pete Rose's teammate, approaches an NBC broadcaster on the field at Fenway. And according to the memory of that broadcaster, his name was Curt Gowdy. Gowdy said that Bench was worried. That Bench was worried because Rose was hanging out with, quote, bad guys. And I don't know exactly who those bad guys were, but what I can tell you is in 1975, during that World Series, there was a man who had access to the Reds locker room, and in fact was in the Reds locker room. His name was Mario Nunez. He was known as, quote, the Cuban, and he was a well-connected man in the Tampa gambling circles. Mario Nunez worked as the maitre d' at Tampa Downs, the horse track there. And he was Pete Rose's good pal. And you know who else liked the Cuban? Sparky Anderson, future Hall of Famer, the manager of the Reds. Sparky thought that October and actually told the press that the Cuban was their good luck charm. So this guy's in the clubhouse. Who knows why? And by 1978, again, based on my reporting, there is a meeting that happens at Riverfront Stadium before a game in the office of Reds president Dick Wagner. Now, Dick Wagner was not a fan of Pete Rose. He had just taken over as president after, serving as VP there for many years. Dick Wagner was sort of a puritanical, militant guy. Pete Rose was not his flavor of ice cream. But this meeting is not about a personal beef. It's about concerns over his gambling. And it's not just Dick Wagner who is reportedly in this meeting. It's at least one official from Major League Baseball, the director of security for Major League Baseball. And this is 11 years before the public, will ever really become aware that Pete Rose, frankly, has a gambling problem.
I got so much to ask.
Yeah.
There's so many questions, but just even you saying his name, it was such a different era. Obviously, someone that didn't live in that era. I mean, with the joke all the time is the 70s, you could be ugly but be sexy. That was Pete. Pete was the coolest guy. He had the look. The name Pete Rose is just an amazing name. It's just like George Best. Like, if people don't know who that is, he's a British soccer player who that's an incredible name. They live up to those kind of names. So, like even you calling the book Charlie Hustle, I love, because what was it? Whitey Ford, you called him that when he ran down, hustling out a walk to first base, where people love Pete. And I think the difference now, again, my generation is softer. Millennials are definitely softer, but I think we think more about the sickness. And that's what Pete had. Pete, like, all of us on here are pretty normal people, right? We all might have some type of addiction to things. Chad likes to eat good nuts and eat olive oil. That's his addiction. That's a good addiction to have. Pete was chasing something he could never catch. And I think the Philadelphia area where we talk about Pete, our whole thing is it felt like the MLB enabled it. Why did they let him keep coaching? When they knew he had this problem, why did they keep him in the sport? And I would love to ask someone like you who are so close to it. MLB takes no ownership for this. They put it all into Pete, where it felt like they were the enabler in so many different ways. And I know it's a different time, but I would love to know what you think about that, where the MLB, in what way did they try to help Pete in any way that you looked into it? Did they ever try to help him, or were they just waiting for him to really get caught to bring their hammer down on him, and they were just biding their time this whole time?
The details of that 1978 meeting and whatever investigation happened that spring are shady. They're murky, just like the details around Shohei Ohtani right now. So I can't say if, they were really worried, or if Pete set their, allayed their concerns in the meeting up in Dick Wagner's office. I don't know what happened there. What I do know is that when they became aware of his gambling on baseball, they did act quickly. In 89, February 89, just like right now, where they were weeks before opening day, Major League Baseball gets this tip that Sports Illustrated's digging in to his baseball gambling, and they hold a secret meeting in the office of Major League Baseball. And that meeting is attended by Pete Rose's attorneys, the outgoing commissioner, Peter Uberoth, the incoming commissioner and current National League president, Bart Giamatti, and by Bart Giamatti's good friend, Fay Vincent, who was the deputy commissioner. And, I did so much reporting around that meeting because this is another turning point for Pete Rose. In the same way, there are probably several turning points happening right now in baseball. Based on what I learned, if Pete's honest that day, when they ask him point blank, have you been betting on baseball? The whole narrative is different. The whole story is different. And I don't mean to suggest that he wouldn't have been punished or that Major League Baseball would have buried the story. They wouldn't have. They would have had to do something because Sports Illustrated was coming out with a series of articles. But remember, Pete Rose was good for baseball in 1989 in the same way that Shohei Ohtani is good for baseball right now. And so the idea that Bart Giamatti had some kind of vendetta against Pete Rose or wanted to bring him down is just a false narrative. They would have done everything they could to save him, to salvage him. And specifically, based on my reporting, Peter Ueberroth, the outgoing commissioner, did not want to saddle Bart Giamatti. And Ueberroth had navigated some tough situations just a few years earlier. In like 1983, 84, there's a huge cocaine scandal in baseball. And it snares a lot of guys. Dave Parker, Keith Hernandez, Yogi Berra's son, Dale, big names. And these men aren't on trial, but they have to come and testify at a trial for a prominent cocaine dealer in Pittsburgh. And Ueberroth was commissioner. And lots of people were calling for suspensions or bans because this is another thing that's bad for baseball. But Ueberroth threads the needle. And he realizes that bans and suspensions are just going to make it worse. So he lets them testify. He lets it play out. And then one by one, he gets the men who were implicated in the trial, including Hernandez and Parker and others, to essentially apologize, mea culpa, and donate a portion of their salary to drug treatment programs, and poof, it's gone. And again, I don't mean to suggest that it would have been poof gone with Pete Rose and gambling, but Peter Ueberroth, based on my reporting, wanted a quick solution, something that would not saddle Bart Giamatti with this, something that would maybe salvage the season, and none of that happens.
Simon, you make a great point about how different generations look at this. And in so many ways, gambling is an industry that is obviously now legal, more professional, a clean, well-lighted space that it's existing in. At the same time, a guy named the Cuban is hanging out in the locker room of the Cincinnati Reds, who are the greatest baseball team of the 70s. And not only is their best player familiar with him and betting with him, the manager is referencing him. And it almost seems like the transverse, because you would never be allowed in a locker room. And you do this above board in legal states. And no one would ever be caught dead saying, oh, yeah, my friend Simon Hunter. In the 70s, it was so accepted as a regular part of life. And it's fascinating to me how different this is right now. I don't know if I have a question from that, but I'd like both of your perspectives on the way that's changed and how it's completely flipped, even though now it's a legal industry. Keith, I want to hear what you have to say first.
You make a great point, Chad. I mean, the fact that the Cuban was in the locker room, the fact that in the 1980s, Tommy Giosa and Paul Jansen would be in the locker room, and no one would think anything about it. Is a world we can scarcely imagine today, when reporters can hardly get into the locker room, much less, professional gamblers. I mean, Simon, have you ever even tried to have that kind of access? Would it even work at all?
No, me and Chad talked a little bit in the summer. Again, I'm the last person to ever get myself or other people in trouble, but we had a couple NFL players get popped for sports betting. And I told Chad, people are going to be amazed over the next coming years of how many of these stories are going to pop up, because they just don't understand that this has been going on for a long time, but it was all in the shadows, like Chad said. Now it is in the light, and they do have all the books working together with the government to catch these people. So my view it is, you know, I have clients and people I work with that are either ex-athletes or still very friendly with professional athletes playing now who do bet like during their off season. So, to me, we were never going to get any bigger than Ohtani. This is as big as it gets. Really, I can never see Patrick Mahomes getting caught in this type of scandal. I really can't. Where that's the most amazing part of the Ohtani part of it. Where the Pete Rose, I think when you think back to that era, it's not as shocking, right? Things were just different, and there wasn't social media everywhere. There weren't cell phones everywhere, taking pictures of people everywhere. Like you could get away with so much more. It's just crazy how humans don't change, though. Even though people know they're going to get caught, they still think they're going to outthink it. So, this is a long way of talking. Your view of all of this. You've dealt with Pete and all these people now. Is where he's at today. Like, this guy who randomly posts videos online, right? Where I don't know where he was at. Was he in Vegas? It looked like he was in Vegas.
It looked like he was in Vegas. Yeah.
Can you believe that he's carried, like, you just talk about he's a superstar. He's the Ohtani of his era, even bigger. Can you believe we're still obsessed and really interested in about him 40 years, 30 years later, where it's incredible. That's how impactful he was, that he stayed this interesting. Did you really think you'd be writing a book about him in 2024?
Probably Chad, I got a list of story ideas that is just always going, right? And some of those stories are short form magazine, radio story, and some of them are potential book ideas. And Pete Rose had just sort of been on that list for me for some time. And I think it's not just because of his iconic nature that we still care. To me, I think it's because of the narrative itself. I mean, it's just got all the elements. And from the very first days of my reporting on this book, which is almost now 2.5, 3 years ago.
Wow.
I wasn't thinking about it as a baseball story. And I want to be clear, like there are so many baseball scenes in this book and entire chapters upon chapters, written about baseball, some of the most iconic moments in baseball. But to me, this was a story about a man. And I began to think of him as almost like Icarus, this Greek figure. He was Icarus in red stirrup socks and black cleats. He was going to fly, but inevitably he was going to fall. And one thing that I just had to do as a writer, once I had the reporting, once I had the material, is just stay out of my own way. Let the story carry it, because the narrative is just there for you. And, Chad knows this. Sometimes you gotta find the narrative. You gotta figure out how to make it work. In this case, I just had to stay out of my own way, because the Pete Rose narrative is just the kind of story that humans gravitate to.
We talk about access in the locker room and people like the Cuban. We said it in the beginning, and we sort of referenced it in a joking way, that Tommy Gioso was Pete Rose's interpreter. But that's how these things happen now, right? The interpreter is the one who has access. What stuck out to me is that the interpreter is in debt $4.5 million. Simon, how is an interpreter making $300,000 a year, getting any kind of credit line that is $500,000 at a time to make bets?
Again, I'm not trying to talk out of school and get in trouble, Chad, but in the bookie world, they might as well be federal agents. Everything you think of, people, they've looked into every little thing. And the biggest thing they're looking into all that is because they don't want you to pull a runner, because that's on them. And the seedy underworld is, these people are connected to not awful people. Like, seriously, like I am the very sweet, childish face of the underworld. Like, my happy, bubbly personality is not 80% of the norm of these people. These are people you don't want to be in business with. So I think that's a little bit what Chad's touching on here, people, is you would not lend out this kind of money unless you knew it was backed by someone that had the equity for real, because that's the end of your life. And your life is not worth some random guy making a bet. He is one of many clients to this bookie. He is obviously a bigger fish in the pond, but he's not the fish. So I would love your Keith's perspective of this, where like he knows it's all these guys running the money around, right? The Pete was smart enough that he didn't want to be connected to it, right? Where he tried to keep his distance. That's just the world they live in, right?
Yeah, so we are fully wading into the pool of speculation now. But one thing that rings true about what you just said is how the bookie, the alleged bookie in this case, must have been thinking about his dealings with the interpreter. In the 1980s, Pete Rose doesn't get in trouble in 1989 for something he did 3 weeks earlier, something that Tommy Giosa did 3 weeks earlier. This has been happening for 3 years. It's been bubbling to the surface. And in that time window, bookies were extending Pete Rose a very large credit line, not because they were talking to Pete Rose, but because they knew that Paul Jansen was sitting in the basement of Pete Rose's house in Indian Hill, Ohio, with the hit king, and they were extending a credit line to Tommy Giosa because they knew that Tommy wasn't placing a $2,000 bet. It was Pete Rose placing a $2,000 bet, and I know that not because I'm speculating, but because when the investigation happens in 1989, and one of these bookies does turn state's evidence and will happily sit not just for a deposition and interviews with law enforcement, but will sit for a deposition with Major League Baseball. They ask him, because they're now pressing to make sure they have the facts. How do you know that you were dealing with Pete Rose? Why did you extend, such a credit line to a man like Tommy Giosa, who was a guy who just worked at a gym? And the bookie said clearly again and again, well, I extended the line and I let him carry this debt because everybody knew it was Pete Rose behind him. Everybody knew.
Yeah. People that fish know when you have a big fish on the line, you don't let it go. You keep.
And the other thing that is interesting synergy too is I read in the Los Angeles Times, which again is doing a great job, in my opinion, reporting this story, that the alleged bookie in this case was bragging to folks in the underworld that he had Shohei, or that he was connected to Shohei, which, by the way, is the same thing that bookies did in the 1980s when they were connected to Pete Rose. Same.
Unbelievable. And, just thinking about Pete and the Hall of Fame, and now that MLB is in bed with baseball and the times have changed, I know that they do hold a grudge against him, and he has not helped himself at all, right? I mean, everything he's done, all of his antics the year since, kind of sticking his nose out at it, and all of that, Pete's not helped himself in any way. Not saying he has. We all know there's other stories about Pete off field. Horrible person, has done horrible things. We are talking strictly what Pete did for the game of baseball in the 70s and 80s and how impactful he was to the sport. This is why I believe he should be in the Hall of Fame. He was one of the best players at it. He brought an insane amount of fans to the sport. No one can deny that he brought fans to the sport, because not only was he a Hall of Famer for the Cincinnati, he came to Philadelphia and became a Hall of Famer. Like, when I think of the Powder Blues, I think of Pete Rose and that hair flowing. So your view of it, someone that's closer than anyone else, you think Pete should be a Hall of Famer?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? Or as Pete would say, that's $100 million question, because that's what he thinks he lost by being banned 35 years ago. I want to be clear, my book isn't a book about making an argument for Pete Rose. It's not making an argument against Pete Rose. The book is not about opinions, and I spend very little time on the Hall of Fame issue. It's in the last act of the book. It's in the wreckage section of the book, and there is a lot of wreckage. But of course, yeah, like every sports fan, I've thought a lot about it. And I thought a lot too about just how we honor athletes in general. And, my prevailing thought at this point is I just feel like we've really lost perspective. We like to put our athletes, our famous ones especially, on pedestals, and we like to ascribe to them moral values that they may or may not have, that they may or may not deserve. And the fact is, we just don't know that much about them. And the Shohei story shows that again. Again, whether he's whatever has happened here, no one would have expected this story 10 days ago. Nobody. And so, in my opinion, for all of those reasons, I believe that players in general, in baseball, in football, in basketball, and beyond, should be honored or enshrined into the Hall of Fame for what they did on the field, on the court. And then if what they did in the shadows, if what they did in their bedrooms, if what they did in their personal lives is so bad, so egregious, then I think we should put that on the plaque too. And put that there for perpetuity right next to their accomplishments.
Keith, amazing book. Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose and the Last Glory Days of Baseball. It's gotten great reviews. You have an amazing agent. His name is Richard Abate. Shout out to Richard. Really fascinating stuff. I'm hoping it's a great success for you after all the hard work. Thank you, Keith O'Brien, for coming on The Favorites. As a reminder, catch every episode of The Favorites live on YouTube. For those enjoying on YouTube, don't forget to give us a like and subscribe to the Action Network YouTube page. As a reminder, The Favorites podcast is presented by North Carolina's newest sportsbook, Bet365. Bet365 doesn't do ordinary. That's why you get more boosts with them than with anyone else. Every day, they cover up the odds on hundreds of bets to give you a chance to win more. Bet365 boosts specific markets, your winnings, and even parlays. And they don't stop there. Keep an eye out for their biggest and best odds with the incredible Super Boosts. Check out the boost and see why it's never ordinary at Bet365. Must be 21 or older and present in Arizona, Colorado, Indiana, Iowa, Louisiana, North Carolina, New Jersey, Ohio, Virginia, or 18 and older in Kentucky. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. Terms, conditions, restrictions apply. Be sure to catch our next episode of The Favorites on the Action Network YouTube page, Tuesday, 1:45 p.m. Eastern. Download us from Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your pods. Rate, review, subscribe, leave us 5 stars, say whatever you want. Feedback is a gift. Until Tuesday, love you.